This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 277. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is when RAID isn't enough. ZFS redundancy done right.
Yeah, so in this article, we look at why hardware RAID is still around and why you still shouldn't use it. And we take a look at the fragile, outdated, and risky things that hardware RAID provides and contrast those with the much better solutions you get with ZFS.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Micron announces exit from crucial consumer business. So no more crucial SSDs or RAM, seemingly.
Well, I'm glad to see the back of those SSDs that have always been cursed since day one, but I am sorry to see the RAM brand die. I can't tell you, I literally couldn't even begin to tell you how many times over the last 20 years or so I have gone to crucial.com because that's where I know I don't need to wonder about timings or, anything else about a piece of RAM. I can literally just tell it what system I have, no matter how cursed this weird Dell or HP or Gateway or whatever thing is. And it'll say, yep, here's the RAM for you right here, and you can buy it, and it will work every single time. I'm going to be very sad to see that go.
Yeah, Micron's been a top trusted brand for a long time, and so Crucial was, one of my go-tos for, especially as you're saying, RAM. So I guess I'm down to just one RAM supplier now.
Of course, they're not going to stop selling SSDs and RAM altogether. They're just not going to sell it to consumers anymore.
Yeah, basically the AI boom and so on has meant that they'd rather spend all of their focus on the business segment where they're going to sell server RAM and SSDs. And that market is big enough that it makes sense for them.
I have to say the fluctuation in pricing in both memory and storage leads me to believe that this is not just like a corporate line. Like they're telling the truth about why they're doing it, because I have seen in some cases RAM prices quadruple for the high bandwidth stuff, go from like $80 a stick to $300 plus a stick over just the space of 2 or 3 months. And I've seen similar fluctuations, not anywhere near that dramatic, but SSD prices have been going up quite a bit as well. I need to buy a baker's dozen of 8 terabyte enterprise grade SSDs today, and the price per drive had gone up $500 just in the last week.
Yeah, like even DRAM contract prices. So like you're buying pallet loads of RAM, the price for those scales has gone up by 171%, let alone the retail price of individual things. And so, yeah, the death of hard drives was definitely overpredicted.
So does this mean that in a couple of years, we're going to have a market flooded with used RAM being sold as new, like we've seen with hard drives?
To some degree, but the problem is that the hijacking that's happening here is not a hijacking of finished retail products. It's a hijack of the manufacturing capacity required to create them. And the products that are being built are not consumer-friendly products. The RAM that will absolutely be hitting the market in a few years is not consumer RAM. It's server RAM. And it's not going to be small sticks either. So I think you are correct that we're going to see a glut of used parts when this AI bubble drops, but it's not really going to make its way to consumers. And it's interesting that you brought that up because I'd actually been kind of waiting in the wings. I wanted to bring up that like this is an example of the AI bubble really directly hurting consumers because Micron's cutting muscle here to chase the money. I mean, you think about the story that I told about my reliance on crucial.com is like knowing for a fact, like this is where I can go. It may or may not be the best price, but if I have some weird cursed proprietary system from Dell or HP or whoever, and I'm unsure about the RAM, I know I can go to crucial.com. I can look up that system. I can see, it will tell me how much RAM I can put in that system, what sticks. It will offer to sell me exactly the sticks I need. I mean, this was a big deal. Now, does every normal day-to-day consumer ever change the RAM in their computer at all, let alone have the concerns that I just mentioned? Well, no, of course not. People just go down to the store and they buy a computer and they frequently don't ever change anything about it. I mean, we've covered on this show the idea, people frequently go to the store and buy a new computer because they don't like the software on their current computer. But the point is, we're getting closer and closer down to normal people's everyday experience. And that also affects those people when, even if they're not the person to buy a stick of crucial RAM directly and put it in their own computer themselves, they may still be the person that wants to go to the local PC store and have the local PC store put RAM in their computer. And that's getting more difficult. Less of it's being made, less of the best stuff is being made, because instead we're wasting our manufacturing capacity on this AI bubble nonsense to the degree that there's not enough capacity left over to manufacture the products that we actually need and actually want.
Well, don't worry. Q1 2026 is my prediction on that.
Oh, the bubble's got lots more room still.
Yeah, I would love it if it popped that quick, but it is not going to pop that quickly.
We'll see.
There may be more that we see going into things like the CXL cards that you could fill up with old DDR4 RAM to give a second tier of RAM to your home server or your production server even, and more things like that as side effects to this, kind of like we saw with drive shocking during the floods in Thailand, causing shortages of hard drives. If we're going to now see RAM either being too expensive or just hard to obtain, that suddenly we might even see motherboards for the enthusiast community that still support DDR4 RAM just because it's what you can get for consumers. And one possible benefit, we might see more actual enthusiast motherboards that support ECC RAM if it turns out there's going to be a glut of server class RAM rather than desktop class RAM.
I think it's inarguable that what Alan just described, this idea that we start seeing new motherboards designed to fit older tech because the older tech is available for cheap and does the things you want, like all these other workarounds where you've basically got scavenger piggyback markets that are trying to serve the actual consumer because the mainstream economy doesn't want to bother doing it. Well, the one word for that comes to my mind is Doctorovian. Read any of Cory Doctorow's near future novels, and you see so much of exactly this type of thing, where so much of the story is about people finding innovative and clever ways to hack together ancient tech into something that, is fully functional and, does what they need to do, despite how unfriendly the modern supposedly designed for purpose, but more like designed for anti-purpose gear is.
Yeah, or it's the only way to get something that doesn't spy on you or doesn't not toast your bread because it's not the right brand.
And, off we all go into, unfortunately, a Gibson-esque and Doctorovian future rather than, we didn't get the flying cars and the jet packs. Hell, we didn't even really get the food pills. We sure as hell didn't get interstellar travel. But all the nasty garbage that William Gibson and Cory Doctorow have warned us about, it is coming way truer than I expected it to. I mean, both of those authors, they're near future sci-fi dystopians. And both of them, they're the kind of author where you read the book and you immediately see, okay, there's an enormous kernel of obvious truth inside here, but you think it's a parable. It's been expanded. It's been magnified to make it more visible. I no longer think the part about the magnification.
Cheap hardware module bypasses AMD and Intel memory encryption.
I think this one was worth covering for the name of the project alone. Battering RAM. If you remember Rowhammer and similar InfoSec projects, this one kind of followed the same traditions. You're still looking at timing attacks, but it's hardware assisted this time. Essentially, you plug something else into the RAM slot and you plug the RAM into it. And that gives you the ability to bypass the encryption that would normally keep a computer's operating system from accessing an encrypted enclave in RAM that only a particular VM is supposed to be able to access. That's the way it's supposed to work. An application or a VM is allowed to access RAM, and anything outside that application or VM is not allowed to. That's the theory.
Right. The idea is that when you're running in a public cloud, your VM is encrypted with a different key than the other VM so that a malactor in the other VM can't see all of your stuff just because it's in the same host's RAM.
Correct. That was the big promise behind AMD SEV and Intel's, SGX storage enclaves alike, is the idea that you could treat a public cloud as though it was private because you could trust that even people who had root on the system wouldn't be able to see what was going on inside your VM. And now what makes this really interesting is that AMD and Intel have both basically decided to respond that, oh, well, that is a terrible security flaw, but it's out of scope and we're not going to fix it because it requires physical access. Well, guys, securing the system versus an attacker with physical access is exactly the whole point of those systems. If you refuse to patch a bug that allows somebody with physical access to bypass it, then you have just said, well, screw those features. You find a use for them.
Yeah, and I think one of the big breakthroughs that they mentioned here in the article is that previously, if you wanted to have this kind of like RAM interposer that kind of fit between the socket and the RAM and saw what was going on and can mess with it, those cost like $150,000. The device that the researchers at the University in Leuven there came up with cost less than $50.
We have now entered the Game Genie era of RAM interpolators. And that's essentially what this is. For those of you who remember, the old school game consoles of the 90s and the early 2000s, back when they had actual cartridges, there used to be a product called a Game Genie, and they would make a different version of the Game Genie for every major console that used cartridges. And if you aren't already aware, the cartridges were ROM-based. The actual connectors in there, they lead to ROM, read-only memory. So you would plug the cartridge into your system, and that's why the system essentially would have to boot every time when you change the cartridge. It wasn't just essentially, it really was having to boot because you changed what memory it had available to it. But the Game Genie worked in the same way. You plug the Game Genie into your system, and then you plug the game into the Game Genie, and that way, even though the cartridge itself is read-only memory, you can tell the Game Genie, look, I know this address says dead beef, but I want you to return all Fs instead. And the Game Genie says, okay, anytime you ask me for, what comes from this address, I'll give you the value that you want.
Yeah, and it worked by basically the address where the game happens to store the number of lives you have left. Instead of 3, it now says 99.
All of which is a bit, beyond the point for battering RAM here. But I just found it interesting that, we literally have reached the Game Genie era of commodifying this type of attack because we're talking about $50, about what you would have spent for a Game Genie back in the day, possibly cheaper or less to do, again, exactly the same thing. Just stone axe simple. You literally plug the thing in between. I mean, we talk about person in the middle attacks on this show. This is literally that. You're inserting a thing in the middle, and therefore you're able to interpret and modify the traffic as you see fit. And again, I really want to yell at AMD and Intel for saying it's out of scope because an attacker would require physical access, because that was the only reason to use SEV or SGX in the first place.
But is this not an illustration that if you've got physical access, all bets are off? No matter what Intel and AMD try and do, there's just always ways around that.
I don't think that's necessarily correct, because what this did not do is break the actual encryption. I think that as long as we have encryption protocols that are resistant enough, that take long enough for us to decrypt them, that the data is no longer of value, as long as we've got that, then yes, it is possible to actually prevent somebody with physical access from getting into a system. But it's difficult. You got to think real hard about it. You especially have to think really hard about anything with a physical interface, which again is what we're talking about here. We're talking about plugging something into a socket and then the thing intended to plug into the socket into that. Well, if there was no socket, it would have been a lot harder to put that interpolator in there. So one approach to this could be, you could in theory start seeing servers shipping with soldered in RAM. Like, how about that? Buy a motherboard with a terabyte of RAM soldered onto it so that attackers can't as easily bypass SEV. That is one theoretical response to this we could see. Now, I don't think that's practical enough to be likely, but it's possible in the same way that we see some really high security companies do things like filling up USB ports on laptops, with JB Weld or what have you, to prevent people from potentially compromising those devices by plugging in unsecured USB things. We might see the same sorts of techniques here. Make sure there are no sockets. As much as possible, everything inside an integrated circuit, where you have to leave an integrated circuit, multi-layer runs inside a board where it's really physically difficult to insert yourself someplace where you should not be.
Yeah, in this case, it looks like there are things that Intel and AMD could do to make this smarter. Like this interposer is just using some simple analog switches. to trick the CPU into sending the protected addresses to an attacker-controlled location where the threat actor can then either corrupt that or replay the encrypted memory and see what was inside. So yeah, like Jim said, it's not actually compromising the encryption. It's just tricking the CPU into doing the decryption for it and things like that. They mentioned it's similar to a previous attack called Battering RAM that didn't have a physical interposer. It was all in software. But Battering RAM only worked by bypassing the confidential computing part during boot up, whereas this Battering RAM attack allows memory aliases to be dynamically created at runtime instead of exclusively during the boot process. And so, yeah, in this case, it looks like it is mostly software bugs in the way this encryption is implemented because it was kind of bolted on after and meant to just protect that VM from this VM and not the whole system. That trade-offs made at design time are why this is exploitable. And it doesn't mean it's not fixable, but we see that AMD and Intel are like, well, we're not going to fix it on the old CPUs, so don't bother asking us about that. And on the new ones, it's like, we'll see if there's enough demand.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an easy-to-deploy zero-config VPN that allows you to build simple networks across complex infrastructure. Tailscale is built on the rock-solid foundation of WireGuard with a quick and simple setup process. It has an intuitive admin console that makes it easy to see all your connected devices and machines, your access controls, and all your other settings. I've been using Tailscale for years now to connect to off-site backup machines and tunnel back into my LAN when I'm away traveling. Loads of the other Late Night Linux family hosts love using Tailscale too. Whether it's controlling 3D printers, remoting into relative systems for support, or controlling Home Assistant, Tailscale's got us covered. Tailscale's personal plan is free forever. You'll get up to 100 devices and 3 users at no cost with no credit card required. So support the show and try Tailscale for free today at tailscale.com/25A. If you'd like to bring Tailscale to work, use code LATENIGHTLINUX for 3 free months of any paid plan. Thousands of companies have already made the switch. That's code LATENIGHTLINUX. We recently talked about Windows becoming an agentic OS, and we've got a couple of related stories this time. Google's vibe coding platform deletes entire drive, and also a piece from The Verge about AI browsers not being particularly good right now.
It's like Joe said, what this really is about is the fact, not the idea, the fact that you can't just trust ChatGPT or what have you to act as your agent and, get things done for you in real life. In different ways, both of these platforms promised exactly that. Google Anti-Gravity is a Gemini-powered vibe coding platform. And then in the Verge piece, the Verge author tested 5 different AI-powered browsers, some supposedly designed as an AI browser from the ground up, others, using AI plugins into major browsers like Chrome and Edge.
I hope they did it in a VM. I would have.
Yeah, sure. And the idea there was that, these AI-powered browsers and or plugins, they're supposed to be able to run as agents. So you can have them surf the web for you, and you can tell them things like, find me the best deal on this particular model of laptop and go ahead and put it in the cart for me. Notice the go ahead and put it in the cart. In theory, you can even have it go ahead and buy whatever it found directly. But the thing is, how much do you trust it to have found what it should have bought for you, to have actually found the best deal for it, and to only buy you one of that thing?
Well, it reminds me of the early days of the Amazon smart speakers, where you could just tell it to buy stuff for you.
Better than yet, how about the aborted, I don't remember the name of them. Do you remember Amazon tried having those stores with like no humans in them, where you would just wander around picking stuff up and AI supposedly would track all the things that you got and walked out with and then bill you appropriately?
Yeah.
You remember what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Do you know what the resolution with that was?
Yeah, it was just a bunch of people in India.
Yeah, it was always fake. It was, it was the Mechanical Turk all over again. There were people just watching the cameras and doing their best, and their best was decent. It wasn't really good enough to run a store.
Yeah. I think with that one, the hope was that AI would do it eventually, but for the time being, let's just pay a bunch of people in India to look at the cameras and work out what people are buying. And it just didn't work out.
It turns out sticking an RFID on every barcode was actually too expensive.
And, I will point out also that that was what they were doing. That is not how it was marketed. They did not say from the start, we're going to have people watching cameras and eventually we'll do that with AI. They claimed it was all AI from the get-go and they got busted. So you can kind of see the angle that we're going for here. Back then the idea was just that AI could even notice what you were doing and report on it accurately. Now, we're constantly being told that everything, upcoming should be agentic. Copilot has, an agent, and, all these browsers have agentic options. And the difference between an agent and a chatbot is the agent, rather than just telling you, oh, hey, this site over here has a great deal on that laptop you wanted, the agent can literally just go buy the laptop. You can tell it, go find the best deal on this laptop and buy it, and have it do it. Now, do you want it to do that? Well, moving back to that Google vibe coding story again, that particular developer who was trying Google Anti-Gravity basically just wanted it to help him create software to help managing photos, and instead it deleted his entire D drive.
Yeah, he basically said, hey, anti-gravity, develop me software that'd be useful for a photographer to sort through images and select out the prime shots from a mountain of snaps. And then he noticed his D drive was all gone, and he's like, asks the AI, did I ever give you permission to delete all the files on the D drive?
Thought for 25 seconds, thought for 7 seconds, and then it says,
no, you absolutely did not give me permission to do that. I am horrified to see that the command I ran to clear the project cache appears to have incorrectly targeted the root of your D drive instead of a specific project folder. I am deeply, deeply sorry. This is a critical failure on my part.
Yeah, no shit.
Worse is, I wouldn't trust the AI's analysis of what went wrong. It obviously didn't intend to delete the files. Why do I believe its analysis of why it deleted the files or how it deleted the files?
The same reason you believe anybody that you ask, why did you screw up? How did you screw up? Maybe you believe in their ability to analyze their failure after the fact. Maybe you don't. Either way, of course, it doesn't change the fact that they screwed up. And man, wiping out an entire drive. Now, to the extent that one can go about vibe coding right, this particular user, and I'm just going to say user because this was a vibe coder. And I'm sorry, but you don't get to say dev when you're doing the vibe coding. Spicy take. Anyway, he made a lot of mistakes, even within that genre. He basically turned all the dials to 11 and broke them off. Yes, go into agentic mode. No, don't ask for, permission beforehand before you do things. Yes, get super creative. Essentially, it would appear that this person bought into the hype. They were told that now AI was this hyper-intelligent, super capable thing that could write code for you, and they believed it. And as a result, lost all their crap.
Yeah, at the same time, like they say, the turbo mode is what made it not ask for permission before running commands. But knowing that this person's not a developer, what are the chances they would understand the commands they were asked to confirm and wouldn't have just clicked yes anyway?
Exactly. Yes, 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 next, next, next.
Can I just very unpopularly break in for a moment and say how sick I am of things being called turbo? Yes. How the hell do you feed the exhaust gas through a waste gate back into the combustion chamber of a freaking chatbot to make it do a better job at writing code for you?
Well, it's like turbo mode on those old computers.
That was the common misconception. The turbo mode was to turn off the high speed of the computer and make it slow enough to not break the old games.
Right. Okay.
It didn't actually make your computer faster. It allowed you to turn your computer to be slower because certain games depended on the CPU's clock. And when it went too fast, the game just played at, an unplayable speed.
Right.
Because no, you would never, outside of that specific case, you would never want your computer to be slower than it was meant to be. But yes, either of those cases, either the turbo mode off the old computer, which didn't actually do what people thought it did, or it's a turbo for a motor.
It bothered me a little, the turbo button on the PCs too, more from the fact that it slows it down, not speeds it up, as we alluded to already. If you didn't have an 8 megahertz CPU, pushing the button was not going to make your 1 megahertz CPU go 8. However, if you had an 8 megahertz CPU, pushing the button could give you a 1 megahertz clock, which your 8 megahertz capable CPU would happily slow down to in order to play the old stuff. That part bothered me. I wasn't as bothered about the cognitive dissonance between what turbo actually means and, this computer performance that has nothing to do with exhaust gases or combustion or any of that stuff. It didn't bother me as much because at least it was still like there's a feeling of like a tangible performance acceleration going on. And it's like, it's pretty basic and it's pretty low level. So I'm not that upset about it. But when it's just like, you don't want your AI agent to ask you, hey boss, are you sure this stupid thing I'm about to do isn't stupid before it does it? That is so far beyond anything associated with the concept of turbocharging. It gripes me.
Yes, and also, I feel like Google missed a great marketing opportunity here. That button should be called, I'm feeling lucky.
Yes.
Yeah. Because what you're essentially describing is the -Y flag.
Well, -F-Y. Forcibly just do it and don't ask me any questions.
Yeah.
I remember way back in the day, there were a couple of random utilities that have like a -YYY mode. Or like there's a -Y mode that would answer yes to most things, but not all. But if you gave them 3 Ys, like, oh, you mean it. Okay.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Nick writes, can you guys suggest a solution for bandwidth monitoring on a medium-sized network, 300 clients? I would like to know the MAC address and usage data of people using the network and, if possible, what IP they're visiting, and then reverse look up that to services online. I don't want to do any DPI or SSL decryption. I'm using pfSense for a firewall and can run Docker apps semi-proficiently, so I'd like to set this up myself.
The tool that you're looking for is called nettop-ng, and as I recall, it's actually available as a plugin directly within pfSense itself, which is good because in order to run nettop-ng, you either need to be running directly on the gateway out to the internet itself, or you need to be running on a machine with a NIC in promiscuous mode plugged into a switch port that has been set in monitoring mode, which is getting a little exotic for most folks doing small business type stuff. But just running the plug-in, directly inside your pfSense installation, it's quite easy to set up and works well. You do want to make sure that you've got plenty of CPU and RAM available in your pfSense box, because nettop-ng will likely consume more of both than actually functioning as a router does.
It's likely to mostly report IP addresses rather than MAC addresses. I'm guessing you're wanting MAC addresses to track to the device, and you might have to cross the logs with your DHCP server, which will also be in the pfSense, to get to the MAC address, although maybe NTOP can do some of that as well, but it's mostly going to be looking more at layer 3 than layer 2. But it will do the looking up the websites and also at least some actually figuring out what the application or protocol is. So it can tell, HTTP traffic separated from email traffic and some other things that run on different ports.
At least as of 6.5, NTOP-ng can do MAC address tracking.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.